Okay, so now I'll put that poll up. So these questions are drawing together our understanding of flow and pressure and resistance, and linking this up to what we're going to get into today, talking about blood vessels. So these three questions should be stepping you to the answer for the third one, really. Take another second and we'll close this up. Okay. Okay. Yes, I am sharing results. Okay, so for this poll, the most popular answers are correct, but I see we have a couple people who are a little bit confused about this. So vasoconstriction, that word, we'll get into it in a lot more detail as we talk about arterioles, but vaso refers to blood vessels. Constriction refers to making something smaller, right? So vasoconstriction decreases the radius of our blood vessel. It's squeezing them tighter. And we'll talk about how that works with the muscles that surround our blood vessels and so on. When we decrease the radius, when we make something smaller, when we make that diameter, that radius smaller, increase that constriction, we also increase the resistance. So you can think about it like thinking about coffee straws versus normal straws, right? It's harder to blow through the coffee straw. That's because of the resistance. So something small has more resistance. And the effect of that is related to our equation that I drew on the board over and over again, and I'm going to do it again right now. All right. So our equation, right, is that flow is equivalent to the difference in pressure divided by our resistance. So if we keep the pressure the same, this difference in pressure, we're not changing anything here, but we increase the resistance by making that blood vessel smaller. We're increasing the resistance. We're dividing by a bigger number, which means we end up with a smaller number, right? So our flow would go down. Okay, so we're going to slow down the flow if we increase the resistance. This is going to be important as we start to talk about blood flow to different organ systems. Okay, questions on this before we move forward? Make sure I'm monitoring the chat. Cool. Two screens are very helpful, y'all. Okay. So this is where we left off talking about the physics of blood flow. So we were talking about resistance. Here's directly where you could have gotten that answer about the vasoconstriction from, right? So we're going to be regulating arterial radius, and we'll talk about exactly what an arteriole is in a second. We're either going to be squeezing them tighter, doing vasoconstriction, decreasing the radius and increasing the resistance, or we'll be dilating, increasing the radius, making those blood vessels bigger, wider, decreasing the resistance. You can also think about this like, I don't know if any of you went to really crowded high schools, but I did, right? A wider hallway makes it way easier for everybody to get to class. If you have a tiny little narrow hallway, it's going to take a long time for people to get where they're going. Okay, so those are our resistances, just talking about how wide those blood vessels are. Okay, so here's what we didn't talk about on Friday. Today's Monday. Okay. So total peripheral resistance is talking about all the resistance in our body. Sometimes we're going to be thinking about blood vessels going to a specific organ, right? Like to your liver or something. But most of the time it's not really very efficient or really worth our time to think about each and every blood vessel in your body and its individual resistance and calculate it all out on its own. Often we're interested in the cardiovascular system as a whole, and that's the case here. So our total peripheral resistance is a number that tells us the combined resistance of all the blood vessels in our systemic circuit. The resistance across a network of blood vessels, so all those branching blood vessels in your hand or going to your skin and the capillary beds, the resistance of that network depends on the resistance of all of the blood vessels combined. The flow through the network is going to vary based on the resistance of all those combined blood vessels in just the way we were talking about with the vasoconstriction and the vasodilation, except now we're talking about many blood vessels instead of just one. So if we see vasoconstriction in a network, say, we'll talk about the different hormones that could influence this, but if we see vasoconstriction in a network as a whole, means all of those different blood vessels are shrinking, which means we're going to see increased resistance and decreased flow. And the opposite with vasodilation. If there's vasodilation in the network, you're going to see all sorts of different blood vessels expanding, which will decrease the resistance and increase the flow to that network. So this works on an individual blood vessel level, but it also works on a network level, the physics of it. So that's our total peripheral resistance, TPR. We're going to see this abbreviation a fair amount in this unit. One of the reasons for that is that we're moving from our understanding of physics and fluid dynamics, is what we've actually just been talking about, to our understanding of the actual cardiovascular system, right? Towards actual things we can measure, physiological variables, right? So our initial equation that we've been talking about thus far is just about flow. It would apply to flow through pipes, flow through ocean currents, all sorts of different types of flow, but we're moving towards being able to substitute these variables with actual measurements about the body. So our flow is equivalent to delta P, that's our difference in pressure, that pressure gradients, divided by our resistance, which is essentially, for our purposes, talking about the diameter or the radius of those blood vessels. But when we're measuring these in the body, we're going to sub in specific measurements. So for our flow, what we're really talking about when we're talking about the cardiovascular system as a whole and flow, we're talking about all the blood that we're sending out to the body. And we saw a measure of all the blood sent out to the body by the heart when we were talking about our cardiac muscle, and we were talking about our heart at the end of ANP1. So flow, as we're talking about it now, is really cardiac output, the blood sent out by the heart, abbreviated CO. Delta P, so the difference in pressure, is going to be our mean arterial pressure, MAP. So that's the average pressure in the aorta as it leaves the heart. We talked about that in ANP1. And the reason that MAP, this mean arterial pressure, counts as our difference in pressure as delta P, right? We talked about how it's a difference in pressure that we care about, not an absolute pressure. The reason for that is that the actual value of the blood in the veins returning to the heart is super, super low. We did two examples, one for the pulmonary circuit and one for the systemic circuit on Friday. And hopefully you have those in your notes and can flip back because you saw that I'm a slow and a bad drawer. But the value for that arterial pressure, that CVP coming back to the heart, so it was only 2 millimeters of mercury. So basically we abbreviate that to 0. So when we say that our delta P is mean arterial pressure, our true delta P would be equal to mean arterial pressure minus our central venous pressure. But in terms of the actual numbers for this, right, mean arterial pressure is going to be something like, I don't know, like 88. Central venous pressure is only about 2. So we do an estimate and we just cancel that out, pretend it's 0, which means that we can just use our mean arterial pressure as delta P. So if that's confusing for you, how that became a difference, hopefully that helps clarify that a little. Does anybody have a question about that? Okay. So R in this equation becomes our total peripheral resistance. So all the resistance throughout all the blood vessel networks in the body is our resistance for this system as a whole, the TPR, which means that this equation, CO, cardiac output, equivalent to mean arterial pressure divided by TPR, our total peripheral resistance, is what we're really going to focus on as we apply these rules about flow and pressure and resistance to our cardiovascular system. This is going to be helpful because we now have things that we can measure and things we can directly relate to physiological phenomena. And we'll see that as we get into the CO part, right, we talked about different things that affect cardiac output, right? Like we thought about stroke volume, for example. So we'll see that sometimes we're going to be interested in more details here about the flow end. We'll see things that affect our mean arterial pressure and things that affect our resistance as well in this unit. Okay, so these two equations are the same thing. This one is just a little more helpful once we've moved into our understanding of blood vessels. Okay, so I'm going to give you a second to flip to our next PowerPoint in case you print them out. I know a lot of people like to take notes by hand, which is good, actually. Studies show that that helps you remember stuff better. Okay. So our goal for this section is to understand the structure and the function of our different types of blood vessels. So I've been throwing around not too many words, hopefully, right? I've been talking about arteries, but I've also talked about arterioles. We're going to zoom in a little bit on each of the different types of blood vessels we're going to see throughout the cardiovascular system, because they're going to differ in their components, what their walls are made of, and therefore also in how they interact with pressure mostly. So our overarching question here is, what kind of anatomical differences we're going to expect to couple with physiological differences in the vasculature? So we know the physiological differences, we're interested in changes in flow, changes in resistance, associations with pressure. Now we're going to pair that with what these vessels actually look like. So these two sort of different types of understanding about the body should come together. Yeah. So this figure is from your book. It's a helpful image of each of the type of blood vessels we're going to be talking about over the next couple days. So very shortly, okay, arteries are defined as anything that carries blood away from the heart. You've seen some in lab, and we've talked about some in lecture, right? Specifically, we keep talking about the aorta going away from the heart. That's an artery. We talked about the pulmonary arteries going from the right side of the heart, bringing blood to your lungs. Arteries are big, and they're going to have a lot of blood flow through them. As we move down through this chart until we get to the capillaries, we're talking about branches of arteries. So we're getting smaller and smaller vessels. What we refer to as the microcirculation are these three types of vessels in the center of the chart. The arterioles, so they still have this art part at the beginning. They're still carrying blood away from the heart. They're going to be really, really small. You're not going to see named arterioles in the cadaver lab. right? So these are small things, but they're going to be really important to our understanding of how the whole network of blood vessels works. So our arterioles, very small, carrying blood to the capillaries. Even smaller, the capillaries' role is going to be as the site of exchange for all the nutrients we're trying to get to our tissues, and then also for all the waste products that we are going to be returning to the heart, but also may eventually be expelling, right? When we talk about the site of exchange, I will give you a sort of preview here. Usually we're talking about oxygen going to the tissues and carbon dioxide leaving the tissues. So when we talk about exchange, that's really going to be the focus in our course. So then venules are like the opposite of our arterioles. They're taking blood away from the capillaries. And then we're going to see our veins, big veins. These would be the named ones. These are things that you'll see in lab, going to return the blood to the heart. Okay. What you can also see in this chart is we have the average internal diameter. So that is how big what we call the lumen of the vessel is. So the lumen of something is like the space inside, the empty space inside. So the part where the blood would go. And we have the average wall thickness. And the reason this is interesting, right, this wall thickness, so we're going to see that there are different numbers of layers and different thickness of layers in our different vessels, right? So we can see that our arteries are really strong, right? They're muscular. They're also highly elastic. They're going to have a thick layer with collagen and elastic properties. We talked about this some when we talked about the aorta, and we're going to come back to the aorta again today. Okay. Our arterioles are smaller, right? We can see that their average diameter, a lot smaller. But we'll see that they're still very muscular, even though they are small. And we're noting here that they're well innervated. So lots of nerves going to the arterioles. We're going to talk a lot about why that is and what the arterioles are doing in this system. Capillaries, super thin-walled and highly permeable to pair with their exchange function. So we'll see that our capillaries really only have two layers, right? They're going to have a layer of cells and they're going to have a basement membrane. So they're going to be really specialized to allow stuff through to get to the tissue. The venules are thin-walled. They have a little bit of smooth muscle, but nothing like, for example, our arterioles. And then we'll have the veins. They're thin-walled compared to the arteries, which are otherwise of similar size. They're fairly muscular, and we'll see that they're highly distensible, and we'll talk about what that means for our body when we get to those. Another thing to note about the structure of the veins is we're going to see that the veins actually include valves throughout the venous system. For arteries, we only really see valves in the aorta, and that's like it. So while we have this chart up, I actually want us to do a couple of prediction questions. So I got another poll for us. Okay. I want you to predict which vessels are going to have the highest resistance based on the diagram, and where you're going to expect to see active regulation of the vessel radius. So where we're going to be actively changing how wide that blood vessel is. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end that poll. Okay, so looking at this chart for this first one where we're looking at the internal diameter, that's this leftmost column, looks like most people said capillaries. That's right. So just based on the average diameter, we're going to see that any individual capillary is going to have a lot of resistance and therefore slow flow through any individual capillary so that we have time to exchange stuff across the capillary. We are also going to talk a lot about resistance in the arterioles. So those don't have the smallest average diameter, but actually we're going to see that the arterioles have this combination of being small, so they have a bunch of resistance, but they also have muscles with lots of nerves going to them, so that we're going to be able to change that radius really easily. So our arterioles are actually where we're going to see most of our active regulation of the radius of those vessels, with the exception of, as most people put, some of the arteries. So we have arteries we call muscular arteries that have tons and tons of muscle. So we'll see that those act in a similar way to the arterioles and do a lot of active regulation of how wide that vessel is. Cool. Yeah, so that's why we care about the presence of muscle, right? Because that means we can actively change that radius by squeezing that muscle. And we care about the overall diameter because we care about how fast blood is going through that vessel, because that's going to change what the vessel can do. Okay. So we're going to go through each of these kind of in order. So all of our vessels are going to have some similar components. So our blood vessels have many layers. Here on the left, we see an artery. On the right, we see a vein. So we're going to see in the center of our blood vessel, directly surrounding the lumen, which is the hollow space, we have an endothelial layer. So that's just like epithelium that we saw in Phys lab in Phys 1. It's just a specialized type of epithelium that lines the inside of our blood vessel. So they both have that. Other components we're going to see variably, depending on what blood vessel we're talking about, is smooth muscle. I know we touched on smooth muscle really briefly in A&P1. We'll think about it a little more critically now that we're in A&P2. It's going to be an important component of our blood vessels. So we can see some smooth muscle of varying thicknesses. We're also going to see connective tissue. Some of it's going to be fibrous and some of it's going to be elastic. So fibrous connective tissue that gives structure is something called collagen. We'll also see we have elastic connective tissue, largely made up of something called elastin. So this is going to, the thickness of our connective tissue and what exactly is in that connective tissue is going to make the physical properties of the blood vessel vary. So like how stretchy they are, their compliance, which we'll talk about in a second, is going to differ depending on some of the properties of this connective tissue around the outside. Okay, so starting with the biggest, starting where we start, leaving the heart, we got our arteries. Arteries' main job is as a rapid transport pathway. That's why they have such a large diameter, right? A large diameter means there's little resistance, which means we can have fast flow, right? So the arteries are rushing blood away from the heart, right? Because we want to get blood to the organ systems fast, right? We want that fresh blood going out to all of our different organ systems all the time. So they're the rapid transport pathway. The walls contain both elastic and fibrous tissue. So both those two types of connective tissue. The walls of those blood vessels are under high pressure, right? So we saw, I don't think I pulled up another image of it right now, but we saw how pressure changes across our systemic circulation. And we saw it was really high at the heart and in those first arteries. And we saw a rapid drop across the arterioles. And we had low pressure down in the capillaries. So those arteries are in this high pressure region. And those arteries are also sometimes going to be acting as pressure reservoirs. So specifically the aorta, I'll talk about that in a second. The other type of artery, right? It's a muscular artery. So our muscular arteries are smaller than most of our arteries. You can still maybe see them, but as you can see, they're quite small, less than 0.1 millimeters in diameter. So really depends how close you're looking and how good your eyes are. They don't have very much elastin. What they really do have is a bunch of smooth muscle regulating the radius. So in the muscular arteries is really where we start to see this active regulation of the size of the blood vessel. You can see that these muscular arteries are the really small ones. So let's talk for a second about that idea of being a pressure reservoir. So this is going back to our understanding from A&P1. We talked about the aorta specifically as being a storage site for pressure so that we can have continuous blood flow going to the body, even when the heart is relaxed, right? It's not contracting, it's in diastole, and we still want blood going out through our system. We don't want our blood to start and stop. We know what pulse is, right? We've taken a pulse, taken a radial pulse, right? Maybe we took a pulse here at our neck, right? So there's some change in volume, but there's shouldn't ever be no blood going through our system. The way we do this is by having thick elastic arterial walls that store the pressure and can then release it even when the heart isn't actively pumping a blood right that second. Now we refer to arterial walls as having low compliance. And what low compliance means is basically that you don't have to add much volume to increase the pressure a bunch. So we're going to have a slide on compliance in a second, but the fact that they have low compliance is inextricably linked to this function as a storage site for pressure. So they expand as the blood enters the arteries during systole, right? Just like a balloon expands. Keep my handy dandy balloon for like all of the cardiovascular system at my desk, right? So we expanded it as the heart constricted, sent blood out to the system. Then they recoil during diastole. So there's no more blood coming from the heart, but blood can still go out through the cardiovascular system. So that recoil is why we need these thick, elastic arterial walls. The fibrous part is more to kind of resist the high pressure they're under. Okay, so a little deeper on compliance here. So compliance is a measure of how the pressure in a vessel changes with a change in volume. I only have my trusty little red balloon. I don't have like a big foil birthday balloon, but I want you to picture one in your head. Okay, so when you have like a little water balloon, right? You blow it up. It's pretty hard to blow up, right? You have to exert a lot of pressure to get that balloon to get bigger, right? It's really hard. You huff, you puff, you huff. Hard. That is basically an example of low compliance. So you only need a little bit of volume to store a lot of pressure, right? The reason you have to work hard, the reason you have to put in a lot of pressure is because this low compliance means that to get a little bit bigger, you have to fight against that pressure that you're creating with this increase in volume. Something that has high compliance can change a lot in terms of volume without very much change in pressure. So you need a lot of volume in order to create the same amount of pressure that you would have in something with low compliance. Really why we care here about compliance is what we're comparing basically is the arteries versus the veins. And it may be kind of helpful to think about the way they look in the cadaver lab, right? Our arteries, we can see all that connective tissue, right? Like that's why they're white. They have this thick layer of tissue. When we squeeze them, they bounce back, right? So we can see this low compliance. We can think about the pressure it would create if you tried to fill up that artery more than it wanted to be full. By contrast, the veins have high compliance. So we see the veins in lab, but they're kind of like flat, they're darker, you can see the blood inside, right? They have thinner walls. Basically, the veins are just going to act kind of like a foil balloon, right? If you blow into it, super easy to blow into it. There's not much of a change in pressure at all until you get to its basically maximum volume that it can hold, right? You need to put in a lot of volume before you're going to see a difference in pressure. So those veins, they're flat, right? If you put more volume in them, no problem. They just get bigger. They were floppy to begin with. Doesn't make much of a difference until you've put in a large volume of blood. So arteries have low compliance, means they're stretchy, means they hold pressure. Veins, high compliance, means they can hold a lot of volume without creating much pressure. This is good based on where they attach to the heart too, right? Our blood is moving due to a pressure gradient. The arteries are leaving the heart, right? So they're the start of that pressure gradient. We want high pressure there. And the veins, they're returning to the heart. That's where we need low pressure because we want the blood to flow from the arteries through all our systems and back to the veins and back to the heart. It's important that we don't have much pressure in those veins. Okay. So the pressure in the arteries and specifically in the aorta does vary with the cardiac cycle. So we're going to see that during systole, right, when the heart is contracting, our blood pressure in the aorta is going to reach its maximum as blood flows into it. Right? So we're ejecting blood out of the heart into the aorta. We've put volume into the aorta. It has that low compliance, right? So we added volume, which means we added a bunch of pressure. During diastole, by contrast, when the heart is relaxed, our aorta is going to be at its minimum pressure, right? We're actually going to be releasing the pressure from that elasticity in the walls, right? It's getting smaller, it's getting rid of its volume, which is dropping its pressure down. So it's never going to be at zero pressure because of that elastic recoil, right? It's recoiling and then it's going to get filled up again. So we're not going to reach zero pressure. But that's going to be when we see our lowest pressure. I saw a question, I think from a while ago, about the compliance. So yeah, the compliance of the vessels does partially have to do with the thickness of those walls, right? The thin walls of the veins have high compliance. And the elastin and this elasticity are also related to that low compliance in the arteries. Okay, so talking about the arteries here in the aorta, we can measure blood pressure, right? You probably all had your blood pressure measured. So we don't measure it directly on the aorta, right? That's right next to your heart. It's in your chest. You got your rib cage around it. Not very convenient. So we measure blood pressure out on the brachial artery, so right above your elbow. What we're doing when we're measuring the blood pressure, we have that, I actually have a blood pressure cuff with me. I love props, right? This one happens to be a little broken, so we are going to have to do a little imagining, but we'll see a video, right? What you're doing when you measure blood pressure, they tell you to put this cuff on your upper arm. And usually now they use one that measures automatically, but we're going to be thinking about how you would do this old school. So you put the blood pressure cuff on the upper arm. Then the other thing you have is something called a sphygmomanometer, which is going to be showing us the pressure changes. All right, so what's happening when you inflate your blood pressure cuff, right? You say you have this thing and you squeeze it. This is the part of my blood pressure cuff that's broken. This inflates, all right? So the blood pressure cuff inflates, but at the same time on your dial, you're able to see how much pressure we've created in that cuff by inflating it. This can sometimes hurt if it inflates a lot, because what you're doing, and this is what you're doing on purpose, is you're compressing the brachial artery. We're trying to compress it to a point at which it's totally closed. So when there's no blood flow at all through that artery. Then we slowly release pressure. Watch the dial, right? We're watching this sphygmomanometer to see what the pressure is as we're releasing pressure. At the same time, we have a stethoscope. We're listening, and we're listening right below the cuff. What we're listening for is when we can start to hear turbulence in the artery. So we talked about turbulence and sounds when we talked about the heart. But when we start to have turbulent blood flow, that creates a sound, basically, as that blood is kind of like bouncing across the walls. When we're talking about blood pressure, we call it the Korotkov sound. The pressure at the first start of this sound is the systolic blood pressure. The reason for that, right, is we've taken the cuff, we've cut off blood flow. As blood is building up, right? So our heart is pulsing, right? We have our heartbeats. So at a certain point, that high pressure, that systolic pressure, will be more powerful than your cuff that's cutting off the blood, but the diastolic pressure will not be. So we're going to start to hear a sound because we're going to start getting this case where we have a little bit of blood flow coming through as that systolic pressure wave pushes through, but the blood is still going to get cut off when the heart rests in diastole. So that's what's happening when we start to hear the sound. And we mark that down as our systolic blood pressure, right? So that's where we have the pressure coming from your artery equivalent or more than the pressure in the cuff. And we keep listening and we keep releasing pressure in the cuff because laminar flow, which is just like smooth flow, nothing interrupting it, has no sound. So we have to wait until we hear absolutely no sound with our stethoscope, because that tells us that even the pressure of that artery during diastole is enough to fight against the blood pressure cuff and enough for that blood to flow unimpeded. So when we're taking blood pressure, we're going to be listening. We're going to start with silence. Then we're going to start to hear a sound, and it's going to continue until the sound disappears. So we're marking when that sound started, and when that sound ends, we have our diastolic blood pressure. We're actually going to watch a couple of videos to practice this as well. But first, we're going to look through some handy dandy graphs. Hopefully the overall concept kind of makes sense, but this is how we add numeric values onto this, all right? Okay. So this is the full pressure, the full picture, but let's go through this one by one. So we're starting out here. We've applied a blood pressure cuff to the arm above the brachial artery, all right? So here we see our cuff, and we have some pressure in the cuff. In this case, we're reading a blood pressure cuff is at 130. Right? Our stethoscope is below that cuff, so it's on the artery that's being cut off because we're waiting to see changes in the blood flow in that artery. So the beginning, super constricted, no blood flow, no sound, nothing's going on. Our heart is still beating, right? A blood pressure cuff does not turn off your heart. So we are going to see changes to the pressure in that artery. So if we were imagining this artery, like right above, we'd still have changes in pressure. But because the pressure in the cuff is really strong, stronger than the pressure in that artery, it's still cutting the blood vessel off. Nothing's happening, no flow, no sound. Then we reach the point when our systolic pressure, right, so the high pressure in the artery, hits the same value as the pressure in the cuff and even goes above it, right? This is when we're going to start to hear sounds because we start to have turbulent flow. So that's what this kind of wind-looking picture in this compressed artery is at the bottom. That's showing us the turbulence, right, the kind of bouncing of the blood. which we can actually hear if we're listening for it. So we're going to write that down when we first start to hear the sound as our systolic pressure, because this point, right, is where the pressure in the cuff, which we have a meter for, is the same as the systolic pressure. So if we can hear the sound, this point where we start to hear the sounds, we know that we've found that point of equivalence. As we continue, we're going to keep hearing the sound because this blood vessel is basically going to be kind of like turning off and turning back on again as we have systolic pressure higher than the pressure in the cuff, but diastolic lower than the pressure in the cuff, until we reach the point where the diastolic pressure in that artery, even this low diastolic pressure, is more than the pressure in the cuff. At that point, we can have laminar flow. There's nothing constricting that artery anymore. It's just pure smooth blood flow. There's no sound for that because the sound is the turbulence of the blood. If it can just go straight through, it's not bouncing around, you're not going to hear it. Okay. One final thing before we practice. So when we give a blood pressure, we give it as systolic pressure, so the high one, over diastolic pressure, the low one, right? So contracting heart versus relaxed heart. So like 110 over 70, the textbook value is like 120 over 80, right? When we want to know MAP, right, for these purposes of understanding flow, differences in pressure and resistance, we have two numbers here, right? So we have to figure out kind of what the average pressure is, right? Our mean arterial pressure. To do that, we're not taking a pure average like 110 plus 70 divided by 2, because our heart spends more time in diastole than in systole. So when we calculate MAP, we're taking basically a weighted average. So we add together our systolic pressure plus 2 times our diastolic pressure. We could add it twice, right? Numbers work the way numbers work. And then this whole thing is going to be divided by 3. That's what's going to tell us the mean, because we're thinking about like a mean over time, and diastole is about twice as long as systole. Another thing we can measure is something called the pulse pressure. So this isn't really going to factor in much to our discussions of blood flow right now, but it is a value we can take. So the systolic pressure minus the diastolic pressure is called the pulse pressure. So 110 minus 70 is 40, right? That's going to be the difference between the pressure when our heart is contracting versus when our heart is relaxed. Oop. Okay, we can do this. So one more poll question. So we're thinking about the anatomical features associated with high pressure. Okay, I'm going to stop this in a second because I do want us to get to a blood pressure example because it's fun, something you can maybe do at home. Okay, so about half of you got this correct. It is the valves. So valves are mainly going to be seen in our venous return to the heart. And we'll see that the valves in the veins are actually to fight against gravity. But all of these other things are true. So we have elasticity and low compliance as we have high pressure in the arteries as that blood is shooting out of the heart. And we're storing that pressure in the walls. So elasticity and low compliance are helping us store the pressure. We have thick, smooth muscle walls. I guess we didn't touch on that much, but that is true that we have thick muscle walls in the arteries, because if we ever do really need to cut off blood flow in the artery, we'd need to use a lot of muscle because we have a lot of pressure. Valves are for veins. The large amounts of fibrous tissue are to make sure that our arteries don't distend too much, right? We don't want them to expand too much. We want them to be able to resist that pressure, and there's a lot of pressure there. Okay. Stop sharing those. Okay. So now I want to do number 1 first. Okay. So what we're looking now, right, is at our sphygmomanometer. Fun word to say. We're going to be listening to a blood pressure sound. We're going to be trying to figure out what that person's blood pressure would be. So we're looking for the systolic pressure when the sound starts, and the diastolic pressure when the sound stops. Now, I do want to caution you, sometimes you're going to hear little sounds as like a patient shifts or something weird is going on as the blood pressure cuffs shift. So when we say hear a sound, hopefully after you listen to this once, it'll be obvious what sound we're talking about. And someone, if you can't hear this sound when I turn this on, quick, put that in the chat. I think you should. I'm going to replay that now that you have an idea of what to expect. If you didn't before, try to take down a number this time. I'll talk about it. Maybe I'll pause it as we get there. Here we see some kind of extraneous sounds. You can see the needle starting to kind of pulse. So then we really started to hear the sound, right, in this region between 100 and 90. So the value we would put down as our systolic pressure when the blood is really getting through and we can really hear the turbulence would be about 98. And now we're going to hear the sound continue until we get back to laminar flow. And that sound kind of cut off somewhere here in this region between 60 and 70. So the official reading for this is 68. So like just below the 70 mark, we hear this laminar flow returning. I'll play this one more time and then we'll go. So our reading should be something like 98 over 68. We're going up. This is where we're squeezing the bulb and inflating the cuff. Okay,